everybody. I'll let people get settled in here for a minute. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Derek Yu. I'm the CEO of Purestake. We're best known for our work on Moonbeam. We're the primary contributor to the project Moonbeam. And I wanted to talk to you today about an idea, a concept that I've been really thinking about, which is Polkadot as a kind of back-end Web3 cloud. And I'll kind of explain through the course of the presentation what that means through examples. But I think it's a very powerful idea and kind of gives a direction to how Polkadot can engage with other ecosystems and scenarios that are happening in the broader Web3 landscape. Yeah. Oh, there we go. So, but first, a little bit of background on Moonbeam. So Moonbeam is a parachain that's deployed on Polkadot. It was one of the early parachains to deploy. It's an L1 blockchain, implements the EVM tech stack, and it is optimized or kind of focused on cross-chain use cases. So that's something that we've been doing quite a bit of work around on the engineering side. I would say that a lot of the original work we did was implementing, in partnership with Parity, the Ethereum tech stack in Substrate. So a lot of work was done doing that, and I think we're known as what's called the EVM of Polkadot. But we also have been working quite a bit on these cross-chain use cases. And that's really a lot of the examples I want to go through in this talk are things that we've learned from working with builders and developers building these cross-chain use cases on Moonbeam. And I looked this weekend. There's an interesting source here. Downtown Moonbeam is a community-run site that lists, has a curated list of all of the projects deployed on Moonbeam. So there's, I guess when I looked this weekend, there's about 330 projects on that list. And so kind of the content or the ideas in this discussion have really come from hundreds of discussions I've had with builders both in the Moonbeam ecosystem and building in other ecosystems. So this is actually believe it or not, the fourth Polkadot Decoded presentation I've been giving. I've been giving them since the start of Decoded. And so as part of preparation for this, I looked back at my previous presentations to see what I talked about in the past. And the interesting thing is that while the details have been shifting and changing over time, a lot of the high-level themes have been the same. And I actually pulled this slide from the original Decoded presentation I did in 2020, because I was struck by how a lot of the ideas, even from this 3-4 years ago, were still quite relevant today and inform the way I think about the space and how it's going to evolve. And so I think that the idea from that presentation is that there's parallels, right? So there's parallels in history if you look at the history of compute and blockchains. I'm kind of big on this history of technology. That's kind of a hobby of mine to read about these things. And in fact, I've been around long enough to have seen a lot of these things play out in the history of compute during my career. So the idea here is that if there's kind of a parallel between blockchains and compute, you start off in an era where there's these very few platforms, the resources are very scarce on them. You develop a bunch of features to help kind of allocate those scarce resources to people that need them. So that's time sharing, potentially in the case of a computer. That's what a lot of the original blockchains were like. I think this PC era, or maybe dedicated server, however you want to call it, that's kind of the era we're in these days where everyone can get a blockchain, right? There's all sorts of app chains. There's different frameworks for building blockchains. Substrate is one of them. So you can have your own chain. And I think really where we are now is in this networking and internet category, right? So you have all these chains now, or all these computers. They're starting to talk to each other. How does that work? What kind of scenarios does that enable? And obviously, in the compute area, this led to a lot of innovation. And I think the same thing is going to happen and is happening in the blockchain space. And of course, as you look to the future of cloud and containers, I think that's where you start to get maybe some future ideas about how things may evolve in the Web3 space as infrastructure and these things continue to move. So this is kind of just a mental framework that I use when I'm looking at Web3 and how it evolves. I'm often looking at these historical parallels to try to pattern match and understand what kinds of things could happen. And so let's drill down a little bit on the cross-chain part. And I want to start just with what I've heard from developers that are building cross-chain. First question is why? Why are you even doing this? Why are you building cross-chain? And I would say probably the most important reason is this notion of addressable market, or TAM. It's a fragmented landscape out there, right? There's lots of different chains, and I think there's going to be even more moving forward. Users, assets are spread across all these chains. So it's very difficult as a developer to pick just one. It used to be that you started, you picked a chain, you deployed there, you made that your home. That is, I think, that was already not really viable, but it's certainly becoming less viable over time. Any particular chain is only going to have some small set of overall users, assets, other services on it. So almost every dev team I talk to these days has some concept of like a multi-chain strategy, like to get at users. But I do think that there is also this efficiency play, right, where different chains are good at different things. So if you can combine functions from different chains together, you can get these wholes greater than the sum of its parts effects. And so I have some examples that illustrate that point. But really, the key thing that is the kind of end result of a lot of these different technologies is to create better user experiences. And I'm a big believer that the user experience right now is probably the biggest inhibitor to further user adoption of Web3 technologies in general. So anything that can improve the user experience is really going to have an outsized effect on adoption for the projects at hand. And I'm really starting to see that, where I think these cross-chain techniques are a way to create abstraction layers so that the user doesn't have to be so intimately familiar or be directly interacting with low-level infrastructure like they do today in a lot of the typical dApp experiences. And so we'll look at a couple examples of that. So I want to just talk for a moment before driving into some example scenarios about just a little bit of the broader landscape and talk about Polkadot and its ideas and how it fits into the broader landscape. And so there's really two key trends that I think about, or that I see, that are simultaneously happening. So one trend is that there is a consolidation of tech stacks, is how I call it, right? So the actual technologies that developers use to implement dApps, chains, there's many of them out there. That number is I think that where the actual traction is happening is shrinking down to some much smaller set of tech stacks. I would put EVM at the top. So the EVM still continues to dominate. When you talk to developers and you look at numbers, EVM is still by far the most popular tech stack to implement a protocol or dApp. But for chains, you obviously have both Substrate and Cosmos SDK as kind of, I'll call them the mature options, with some newcomers like Avalanche's Hyper SDK, perhaps I'd throw in there, but at a much lesser set of maturity. So you have this kind of consolidation of tech stacks. It's very, very difficult these days, by the way, I'd say, to have a standalone chain with some kind of proprietary tech stack. I kind of feel like those days might be over. It's very, very hard to do that, and to bootstrap all the tooling and all the other things around it. That's not for the faint-hearted. So at the same time as there's this consolidation of tech stacks to some fewer number, there's a proliferation of different multi-chain ecosystems. This is a big change from last year. If I, coming to talk to you last year, this would not have been the case. So this is within the last 12 months. There's been a huge movement of other ecosystems talking about what I call ultimately a Polkadot-like concept, right? So it's that, hey, we have a tech stack. You can use that to build an app-specific chain, an app chain. There's going to be many of those app chains. They're going to use some sort of messaging system, ultimately. Well, it doesn't exist for a lot of these yet, to be able to communicate with each other. And so other than Polkadot and Cosmos, there's the Optimism folks have a concept of their superchain. Arbitrum has their Orbit and Nitro SDK. Polygon ZK. ZK Sync has a similar thing. Eigenlayer is a new project on Ethereum mainnet that seeks to take Ethereum security and apply it to what they call AVSs. Avalanche has its subnets. So basically, this idea of application-specific chains, running in parallel, being able to talk to each other, that's basically taken hold in the market. And I'd pause and reflect for a moment that it's a great testament that that this Polkadot idea is correct, basically. This is something that the folks working on Polkadot have been talking about for a long, long time. And I think the market is kind of catching up with those ideas now. And all these are much more nascent ecosystems in terms of technology, but the concept is there and the direction is there. So I think this has some implications, though. So the implication is that what does the landscape look like? It's going to look like many of these kind of connected islands simultaneously coexisting. And maybe they have decent connectivity within themselves, but then there'll be some sort of looser connectivity between these islands. And honestly, I see this as only further fragmenting the landscape, ultimately, because there's all of these options now for building. One common thread that I would point out is that almost all of these new ones are using EVM as the base technology stack. So you can have any color you want as long as it's EVM, I think is how a lot of these people see things. But yeah, many of these different multi-chain environments, at least coming or under development in various stages of development. So I think a question that I ask myself is, OK, what is Polkadot's role in this world that's then proliferating and fragmenting further with all of these different islands? And so that's a question that I'm seeking to kind of answer or think about through the course of this presentation. So let's dive into some examples here to try to make it a little bit more concrete on what we're actually seeing. So I'm using examples from Moonbeam. These are ones that I'm familiar with personally. And they're certainly by no means exhaustive. But it'll give you some sense of the kinds of things that I'm seeing. And I think we can draw some conclusions based on what we're seeing. So I would say one key area of innovation has been around asset movement and how to make the UX for that friendlier. So I just picked a few examples from Moonbeam that I'm familiar with to illustrate the point. The first one is an integration that the Osmosis team has done. Osmosis, for those of you that aren't aware, is an app chain that implements a DEX in Cosmos, so not even a Polkadot project. So what they wanted to do was allow users to one-click deposit DOT into their chain. So how does that work? There's a lot happening behind the scenes here. So there's DOT on the relay chain. It gets XCM kind of behind the scenes moved to Moonbeam. It becomes XC.DOT. It then gets transited onto Axelar. So Axelar is a Cosmos-based interoperability chain. It moves to Axelar. It gets IBC'd to Osmosis. And then it gets LP'd into Osmosis. So there's 7, 8 steps. But guess what? The user, they just click once. They have a one-click experience to do that. So that's kind of the form of these integrations is, you're letting the user achieve some intended goal. You're hiding away a lot of the complexity behind the scenes of how that's happening, right? There's 3 different blockchains involved there. 3 in many steps, right? But the user is kind of hidden away from them. Same thing I'd note at the bottom, these cross-chain swaps I looked at this weekend using something called Squid. Squid is a liquidity router that's built on top of Axelar. The way it works is, as a user, you have an asset on one chain, you move it to another asset on another chain. So you can kind of one-click swap into assets on Stella on Moonbeam from any other chain. It uses Axelar USDC under the hood. Again, there's this multi-step process that's happening behind the scenes, but it's easy for the user, right? The user has this very simple interface. They describe what they want to do, and then all 10 steps that are necessary happen behind the scenes. This is kind of the direction of the future, right? Hiding away more of these complicated steps so that users don't need to go to bridges and interact with all of these low-level pieces of infrastructure to get the job done. And probably the one I'm most interested by is this Moonbeam routed liquidity. That has been a heavily requested feature that's going live on Moonbeam relatively soon, I think within the next month. And the idea there is to basically use Moonbeam as a router. And so, for example, wormhole-based assets can be moved from, let's say, Ethereum mainnet. And they'll be routed via Moonbeam ultimately to a parachain destination. So let's say you're Interlay, and you want ETH on Interlay. So you would go to the wormhole interface on mainnet, select ETH, select your destination with the substrate address, by the way, on Centrifuge. And then behind the scenes, that asset is routed via wormhole to Moonbeam, from Moonbeam to XCM, to Centrifuge, or to Interlay, and then to the final destination. So again, multiple steps happening in the background, but the user doesn't have to go and do each step, right? It's kind of hidden away from the user. So I think all 3 examples kind of illustrate that. This abstraction, kind of hiding complicated steps from the user. That's a pattern I see that is just improving the UX in general, using cross-chain techniques. I'll use another example, an interesting example. So this example is a DeFi protocol called Prime. They're recently gone live on Moonbeam. It's a lending and borrowing protocol. They use what's called a hub and spoke architecture. And so the idea is that their hub is on Moonbeam. So they have this kind of central set of contracts on Moonbeam that record the state of like what's happening in their system across multiple chains. And then they have spokes. So they have a spoke on Avalanche, they have a spoke on Polygon, they have a spoke on Arbitrum, a spoke on Ethereum mainnet. And so they have local contracts on all of those chains. And so now, as a user, I can interact with this protocol from any chain. It doesn't matter like what chain I'm on. I interact with the protocol on any of those chains, and it's one instance of the protocol. It's not multiple copies on different chains. And so this like gives them a lot of competitive advantage, because now, as a protocol, they're basically offering a unified service across all chains. Users can either lend or borrow on any chain that they're on, right? So they can deposit on one chain, borrow, like let's say, deposit on AVAX, borrow on Ethereum mainnet. And it's all coordinated behind the scenes by Moonbeam. And so to give you some sense, I pulled a couple just quick stats here from Axelar Scan this weekend. And so you can see I looked at messages, like cross-chain messages being sent on Axelar. And so you can see up here these top chain pairs here. So when I went to look this weekend, you can see that Avalanche to Moonbeam is the top destination set, like messages being sent from Avalanche to Moonbeam. So what is that? Turns out that's largely driven by users using Prime, like on Avalanche, to work with it. That is resulting in messages being sent cross-chain to Moonbeam. Moonbeam is then acting as this kind of back-end engine that's coordinating the activity across chains. And so, and you can see it's similar for Arbitrum. And by far, like these are some of the largest generators of messages. This is quite interesting to me. The users don't know they're using Moonbeam, right? So Moonbeam is in this kind of back-end role, kind of a back-end infrastructure. The users are using the app on these other chains. It's generating messages, but Moonbeam's performing this important role to kind of coordinate activity across chains. This is a hint of what I think is coming in the future, right? That there's different kinds of roles in the tech stack you can specialize in. And this back-end role is an important one, right? So being connected to all these chains and serving this back-end role, that's beneficial to Moonbeam and to Polkadot, by the way, right? Because as users are using these apps on Avalanche, that's generating Moonbeam transactions, which in turn is generating Polkadot transactions. And so you're meeting the users kind of where they are versus trying to convince them to come to where you are. I think there's something powerful about that idea. The second set of stats actually I looked at that I found thought-provoking were these times these were kind of times to approve to finality, let's say, or what is the as a user experience time in order for something to confirm from different chains. And what I found quite interesting is if you look at Moonbeam, kind of the average time on Moonbeam is about 2 minutes to confirm a transaction. But look at the other chains, right? So Polygon, almost 6 minutes. Ethereum, 17 minutes, and then a whopping 35 minutes on Optimism. And so this shows you that it's kind of the power of Polkadot here, right? So Polkadot has very strong finality properties. And in speaking with devs, this is one of the reasons they like Moonbeam, is because it has these attractive finality properties that make it well suited towards cross-chain use cases. If you try to do these kinds of things on an L2, it's a bad fit. Your users are waiting for upwards towards 20 minutes to have their transactions confirmed. So I found that quite interesting. Let me talk about Exiled Racers for a minute. So that's a game on Moonbeam, and it's a racing game. So there's NFTs. You can purchase pilots, ships. There's different add-ons. This is a game that runs on Moonbeam. They have kind of a multi-chain, cross-chain vision as well. So how does that work? So even if their hub is on Moonbeam, they have a set of racetracks on Moonbeam. They plan to create racetracks on a bunch of other chains, right? So you have kind of different racetracks you can race your ships on different chains. And again, I think the idea is to engage the users where they are, right? There's some users that you might not be able to convince to come to Moonbeam. Well, great. Have them race their ships on Avalanche, let's say. Now, here's where the interesting part comes in. So the data around all those races will get aggregated back to Moonbeam, ultimately, where it has an awareness of what's happening. And then there's this interesting collab with the team at Zeitgeist. So Zeitgeist is another parachain on Polkadot, offers a prediction market. So the scenario is, take out a prediction market on like the outcome of a race, right? So then the race happens, the race results are kind of available on chain. Now that can be checked back to see whether how the predictions fared that people made, like on the predictions market. So again, it's kind of combining, let's say, like cross-chain messaging out to other chains with XCM scenarios with specialized functionality on like another parachain. And so these are the kinds of scenarios that get me pretty interested, right? Where there's multiple different chains that are, you get this kind of whole is greater than the sum of its parts effect from the scenario. So let me speak for a moment about another project called Tanzi. The team is here, in fact. I think Francisco will be presenting later today. So the idea behind Tanzi, this is another parachain project. It's another infrastructure project. The concept or the idea of it is to make chain deployments on Polkadot a lot easier. So I think a lot of it will come into its own once the upcoming para-thread functionality is there. But when you're launching a chain on Polkadot, there's a whole process you have to go through, right? There's crowd loans, there's an auction process, there's a bunch of infrastructure you're responsible for. You have to figure out a way to bootstrap a collator set, how to incentivize them. So the idea of Tanzi is to provide a lot of those functions that are needed as a service, right? So the dev has this very, very easy path from code to production chain, to being able to have a production chain. And so I'm quite interested in this project because I think it's highly synergistic with Moonbeam. And so the way it works is this, that let's take gaming. We've been chatting with some games about this. So the idea is that a game early on may not have a lot of users, but they have a lot of integration requirements, right? They need things like NFT marketplace. They may have other dev tooling requirements. And they can find those on Moonbeam. The problem with a shared platform like Moonbeam is this noisy neighbor problem, right? So once you have a game at scale where there's a lot of users, then you more need your own chain. You need access to the block space for kind of a raw capacity to service a lot of users. The problem is you go to an app chain, then you're left with, OK, well, now I need to recreate all of this infrastructure. If I want marketplaces, DeFi venues, I have to go try to attract those. Here's where the Polkadot architecture comes in, and works so well. I feel like you can have your cake and eat it too, right? So you have a set of shared services so the games can leverage on Moonbeam. And then as they need dedicated or increased capacity, they have this upgrade path to deploy those workloads onto a Tanzi container chain, deployed under an EVM execution model or custom substrate. And so I really see this as something quite unique in the market. When you look around in the market, people are generally either pitching one or the other. It's either you have, hey, we're just this shared environment, but you'll be fine there, or hey, we have this dedicated app chain type environment, but you don't get the shared services. And so I think these kind of examples are things that the Polkadot architecture enables quite uniquely, and it's quite good for. And by the way, some of the scenarios we talked about Moonbeam relative liquidity, that applies to container chain, right? So that's almost like a built-in bridge where now an example I was using, wormhole-based assets can flow in and out of the container chain as part of this XCM integration. You talk to other folks. I've talked to folks in the Cosmos ecosystem, for example, that are deployed chains. Figuring out the bridges back to Ethereum mainnet, that takes a long, long time. I talked to some teams that spent a year just doing that part alone. And so, again, in this scenario, being able to leverage some of the existing services that exist, you can be up and running with that kind of functionality out of the box, which is something uniquely enabled by Polkadot. So when I think about these different examples, I feel like they're all hints at what the future looks like, right? You kind of get these glimpses of what are things going to look like in the future. And I think there's some common themes, right? Where in a lot of those scenarios, Moonbeam is acting as in this kind of back-end role, right? So it's in this role that's facilitating different kinds of cross-chain interactions behind the scenes. And I do like that, right? So Moonbeam doesn't have to be the thing that users are directly interacting with. Even if it's further back in the stack, it's still getting the benefit of the transactional activity. And so I like that strategy. I think there's some applicability even to Polkadot for this idea, right? That being in this back-end role can be quite powerful. And so I realized that this is a little bit of an intimidating looking slide, but what I tried to do here is think about combining a lot of these concepts we just looked at, because I start to get a feel or kind of hints at or kind of this intuition around what apps of the future will look like. And they're not these things that just get deployed on single chains anymore, right? So we might have Moonbeam here as a shared environment, acting as this kind of, I call it integration gateway, right? It's this thing that's coordinating and integrating multiple different components. You have kind of your WAN, let's say, that's connecting those contracts out to other destinations, other chains that are outside of Polkadot. But then you have, of course, I'm calling it the LAN, right? You have Polkadot itself with a number of interesting services on the back end that developers can then use and combine with the smart contracts on Moonbeam to make for a whole, right? So you could have Tanzi container chains, as I was describing, to run heavier parts of your workload. Of course, there's a number of other parachain-based services. There's other ones that I'm pretty hot on, so things like, for example, storage, having a storage parachain that is programmatically accessible from smart contracts. And so you start to get at this kind of idea that there's kind of a Web3 cloud-like idea, right, that is created with Polkadot at its core. But I think historically I was focused more on the right side of the equation of what are the different chains, what are the services. But I realize now, and where the focus for us has been lately, has been more on the left side. How do we take these services in Polkadot and connect them to users and assets that are in other environments? And so that's where cross-chain protocols like Axelar, Wormhole, these are the kinds of things. These are transports that allow us to reach these other destinations. And when you talk to devs, they want to reach those users that are on mainnet or other destinations, right, where a lot of the users are these days. And so I think all of these things can come together in a way that's quite interesting. And you ask the question here, where is this dApp deployed? And the question is, there's not one chain, right? It's kind of everywhere, right? It's on all of these chains. It's on Moonbeam. It's leveraging these services on Polkadot. So that's kind of the direction that I see things going in. And I guess to just leave some thoughts here, or some concluding thoughts. Going back to the original idea at the beginning of the talk, we're kind of in this evolutionary path. If you look at computers going from standalone on-network computers to, in Web 2, before I came into Web 3, I was working on some cloud-based products that had mobile user experiences. We were heavily using different cloud services to power those experiences. There was hundreds of servers, computers, services that were powering those experiences. But the user didn't know that, right? The user just had this mobile experience they were using. And so I have to feel that the evolutionary path is going to look similar, not exactly the same, but similar in the sense that there's a move from being deployed on single standalone chains, solo chains, for your dApp, to powering experiences that are they're leveraging blockchain-based services across multiple blockchains, right? And so that could be a smart contract platform like Moonbeam. That could be using cross-chain messaging technologies like Axelar and Wormhole, but also different kinds of Polkadot-based services. Polkadot provides this ideal environment, I think, to create a set of back-end services that developers can leverage to create these user experiences. So I think if there's one kind of parting thought I'd have is that this kind of this outward-facing component is quite important, I think, to this. When we're in talking to devs, that they need to reach the users where they are. So that's a little bit of my vision for Polkadot. Is it's the best back-end engine for running these workloads, but that back-end engine needs to be connected to where the users are. And the technology exists for that. They just need to be kind of wired together in the right way. And we're starting to see devs do that. But that's something that we're looking to encourage quite a bit of, using Moonbeam as a facilitator for this type of approach. And so that's kind of the idea of this. Polkadot is a Web3 cloud, right? It's it may be not the thing that users are directly interacting with, but it's this powerful engine that sits behind the scenes. And frankly, it is the best, right? I've done quite a bit of looking around. These L2s, for example, are far, far less sophisticated than using something like Substrate to do your implementations. So that's something I can see. That's something that really resonates with developers, I think, when they start looking at this, saying that this is a much better technology for implementing the back end of my app. And so, yeah, I think that's really what I wanted to talk about today. If you guys want to learn more about Moonbeam, about some of these cross-chain technologies, there's a quite extensive developer documentation site. It documents a lot of the concepts I talked about. If you're interested in trying them out, there's tutorials. All of these integrations and tools exist on Moonbeam. Yeah, I'd welcome you guys to try it, or feel free to reach out to me directly if you have a project or want to learn more about these things. So thanks very much.